We have been attempting numerous times to bring a successful proof either to Abaye or Rabbi, whether Yeush or Mida'as is or is not considered Yeush. So far, nothing conclusive has come across. We've tried many times, and nothing conclusive has come. We have even now completed all of the brises. We started that's the hierarchy. The first line of proof is always if you can bring a proof from a Mishnah. That's the highest level of authority. So if you can prove it from the Mishnah. The first couple attempts were from a Mishnah. We could not conclude anything decisively from there, so we went to brises. We couldn't conclude anything decisively from there either. And now we're finally going to go to an Amora. Now, there's one point over here, and that is an Amora generally won't argue with a brisa, but an Amora would readily argue with another Amora. Amora meaning from the times of the Gemara's time, right? Post Mishnah / brisa time. So in which case, so one would wonder, what's the point in bringing a proof from an Amora if we are arguing amongst Amoraim? Abaye and Rabbi were also Amoraim. So what's the point in bringing a proof from another Amora? Well, there are two reasons. Number one, when you go back a couple of generations, then, although that, it is not unheard of that they would pick a fight with one of the earlier generations, but when you have a towering figure like Rabbi Yochanan, who we're about to quote, they are, let's put it this way, later Amoraim are afraid to pick a fight with Rabbi Yochanan, because he was such a towering figure, right, okay, he was such a towering figure that later Amoraim would be concerned about doing that. It's not unheard of. It's not impossible, but it's unheard of. It's unlikely that they would do it. In this particular instance, it's even better because Rabbi Yochanan is quoting a source even earlier than he is, a Tana. Although it's not a brisa, he's quoting it himself, but it is something that is an earlier source than even Rabbi Yochanan. So therefore, the Gemara feels that this is a worthy proof, even though that it is from the Amoraim. So let's get started. Tashma, come in here. Now this is a little bit complicated. We have to get it straight. The Amar Rabbi Yochanan, that Rabbi Yochanan said, Mishum. Now, over here, Mishum means in the name of. The word Mishum could mean because, but in this context, it means in the name of Rabbi Yishmael ben Yotzadak. So Rabbi Yochanan quotes Rabbi Yishmael ben Yotzadak. Rabbi Yishmael ben Yotzadak was a Tana, and so here, although that usually a Tana is quoted in a brisa, here Rabbi Yochanan is quoting a Tana. Rabbi Yishmael ben Yotzadak. Okay. Here's what he said. Minayin, from where do I know? La'aveda, a lost object. Sheshatfa nahar, that was washed down by a river. So if you have a river that, let's say, flooded, and when it overflowed its banks, it now floods down an item, and it just washes it downriver. How do I know that an aveda sheshat fanar shehim muteres, that's muter? Now this is not referring to when you know where it went. This is referring to when it didn't just get pushed onto the next guy's property, or a little down, and you know where it went. This is talking about where it got washed away, and then somebody, a mile downriver, happened to find it, right? The owner, it's lost, it's gone, right? No idea where it is. It got washed downriver completely, no clue, and it just somehow somebody finds it a mile downriver, 10 miles downriver, whatever it is. Are you allowed to keep it? So says Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Tzadok, yes. And how do I know this? Minayin, from where do I know that if you have a lost object that was washed away by the river, shehi muteres, that it is permitted? It is perfectly permitted for you to take this thing. And by the way, it is perfectly permitted, we're talking about over here, even if it has a siman. Because if it didn't have a siman, of course it would be mutter. You don't need it to be washed away by a river, 10 miles downriver, for it to be mutter, right? If it didn't have a siman, and we know that the owner lost it, right? So then it would be for sure that it would be mutter. So we're talking about over here,
For sure, mutter. What?
because if it doesn't have a siman, right? If it doesn't have a siman, then for sure, and if assuming that the owner is aware of a flood and that they were aware of this happening, and that a whole bunch of their stuff got washed down the river, so then for sure anybody can find it. What's the shiloh? There's no siman, and of course they know about it. I mean, there's no shiloh about it. So this is talking about even when it has a siman. So let's say that my basketball, which says Englander on it, gets washed downriver. And 10 miles downriver, somebody finds this basketball. And it says Englander, and even has my name and address and phone number. He's allowed to keep it. How do you know? The answer is, Dichsiv, because it says in the pasuk as follows. V'chein ta'aseh lachamaro, v'chein ta'aseh l'simoso, v'chein ta'aseh l'chol avedas achicha asher tovad mimenu u'mitzasa. This pasuk is one of the psukim in Parshas Kiseitze, where the pasuk, where the description of the halacha of Hashavas Aveda is. That's where the Torah talks about it. And the Torah says you're supposed to return a lost object, and it says, V'chein, and so too, when it says in the previous pasuk that you find a lost object, you have to return it. It says, V'chein ta'aseh, and so you should do, lachamoro. So you should do to his donkey. Meaning if the guy lost a donkey and you can identify whose donkey it was, you got to return that. V'chein ta'aseh, and so you should do l'sim laso, to his clothing. If he has a cloak, he has some sort of clothing that you can identify, then you are obligated to return that. V'chein ta'aseh, and so you should do l'chol avedas achicha, to all of the lost items of your brother, which means any fellow Jew. Now here's the key part of the pasuk that we're going to be discussing. Listen closely. Asher tovad mimenu, which is lost from him, from the owner, u'mitzasa, and you found it. End quote. So you should do to his donkey, to his clothing, to any lost object which is lost from him, and you find it, you are obligated to return it to the owner if possible. That is, provided that he has a siman and it's identifiable, blah, blah, blah. Okay, now listen to the way the Torah describes that. The Torah describes it in the following terms. It is lost from him, u'mitzasa, and you found it. That's how the Torah said. Then you are obligated to return it. It is lost from him, and you find it. So the Gemara, or actually Rabbi Yeush, Rabbi Tzadok, makes a very interesting deduction from that pasuk. Mi she'avuda himenu, someone that it is lost from him, umetzuye etzel kol adam, and it is found by everybody else. Namely, the owner lost this thing. It is readily findable to other people, but the owner lost it, meaning it's the owner misplaced it, the owner dropped it, whatever it is, and other people can find it. So it is tovad mimenu, it is lost from him, and other people can find it, which is the normative case of Aveda, right? You drop something in the gas station, you don't know where it dropped, somebody else can find it, right? You understand? That's a normal case where it's lost from the owner loses track of where this object is, but somebody else can find it. That's asher tovad mimenu, it is lost from him, and you find it. Yatzazu. Yatzasa means excludes this. This literally means taking out. But it means yatzasazu. This excludes this, meaning it excludes a case of where it was washed away by the river. She'avuda mimenu, it is lost from him. The eina mitzuya eitzel kaladim, and it is not found by other people. So let me just elaborate upon that for a minute. The Torah, as we said, describes the obligation of returning a lost object in the following terms. It's lost from the owner, asher tovad mimenu, umitzasa, and you found it. What happens if it's lost from everyone? Let's say that it got washed down a river. Let's say you find it in a pond. Let's say you find it in a river. Let's say you find it in the ocean. You're deep sea diving and you find the Titanic. Right? Are you allowed to take those things? Are you allowed to take something that is lost to everyone? Not only the owner, now it's lost to everyone. So the halacha is, you're allowed to take it. Even if it has a simon. You're allowed to take it. The Torah does not obligate a person to return an item which is lost to everyone. The Torah only obligates to return an item which is lost to the owner that other people can access, and the owner just simply doesn't know where it is. But if it's completely lost to everyone, most normative people would not be able to access this. You happen to be wading in a river and you found it. You happen to, washed up on shore and you happen to find it, or something like that. But it's basically lost to humanity. You're not mechuyev to return it, even if it has a simon. Now, maybe it would be a nice gesture to return it because you do have a simon, right? Be a nice gesture, but you're not obligated. It's as if that the Torah automatically ascribes a Yeush to it, right? It's as if that the Torah is miyayish for him. The Torah says, that's it, you're not obligated to return that. Okay, it's gone, it's done. You are as if, pulling it out from the dead, as if it were, because it's gone to everyone, and you happen to exhume it. It's now it's like a new item. The fact that it has a simon on it is irrelevant. You can keep it anyway. It was lost entirely. It lost to humanity. Therefore, you're allowed to keep it. That's an interesting halacha. I wouldn't have come up with that on my own, but that's what Rabbi Yochanan is quoting Rabbi Shmuel ben Tzadok. And again, it's based on the pasuk. The pasuk says, "You're mechuyev to return an item which is lost to you, to the owner, and found to everybody else." So, ergo, you could deduce. But what happens if it's lost to everyone? You're not obligated to return it. That's the deduction. Okay, now. That's the Bryce. That's not. It's actually a Bryce. It's the quote that Rabbi Yochanan quotes Rabbi Yishmael ben Yotzarek. Okay, End of quote. Now the Gemara makes a deduction out of the deduction. So yeah, this is the part which gets you have to listen closely. The Isura Dunya de Hatera, where it's Aser is similar to where it's Mutter. Isura, where it's forbidden to keep, it's similar to where it's permitted to keep. Now, we just gave you an example of where it's permitted to keep. It was washed away by the river. It's lost to humanity. This guy happens upon it. He's allowed to keep it even if it has a simon, right? That's what we just said. Well, the Isser case, Isser meaning, no, you are not allowed to keep it, and you are obligated to return it. That's what the Gemara is referring to when it called Isser. Isser means that it's forbidden, you're not allowed to keep it, you have to return it. Is a case where it's similar to that. In what way? Ma hetero, what is a case of permitted, where it's washed away by the river? Bein the isba siman, whether it has a siman in it, bein the lesba siman, and whether it does not have a siman in it, shara, it's permitted. The example of where it was permitted, which was washed away by the river, is lost to humanity. That's where the Torah says that we just quoted that you are allowed to keep it, right? That's a case of whether it had a siman or whether it didn't have a siman. It made no difference whether it does or does not. You're allowed to keep it in any case, right? Because that's what we just finished saying. It's lost to humanity. And even in a case which otherwise would obligate you to return it, but since here it's lost to humanity, you're not obligated to return it. Right? Obviously, it makes no difference whether it has a siman or it doesn't have a siman. Well, af isura, even the case where you are forbidden to keep it, when you are required to return it, bein the isbe siman, whether it has in it a siman, uvein the lesba siman, or whether it doesn't have a siman, asura, it's forbidden. Now, frankly, I would not have understood this line very well if it weren't for Rashi. I didn't quote the Rashi here. We're going to start working on Rashi in a future Sugya. But I will tell you what Rashi does say, and that will clarify what's going on here. The pasuk that is all based on, right, is as follows. Again, the pasuk is referring to a case where you're obligated to return it, right? So you should do to his donkey, and so you should do to his clothing, and so you should do to all the lost objects of your brother, which is lost from him, and you find it. Okay? You are obligated to return that, right? Okay. Now, that pasuk is referring to isura, meaning where you are obligated to return it, right? If in a case where it is lost from him only, and you found it, you are obligated, assuming it has a siman, you are obligated to return it, right? Correct? Now, we are deducing from there the case of heter. Since the pasuk verbalizes it in the manner of that it is lost from him and you find it, ergo we deduced that if it's lost to everyone, it's lost to humanity, it's been washed away in the sea or in the river, it's mutter. Right? That's the deduction. Now, Rashi explains. It's a controlled experiment, as they say. Everything is the same except for one thing. The only thing that's different is, in the case of Isser, it was lost only to the owner and everybody else can find it. In the case of Heter, it was lost to everyone. But everything else stays the same. The difference is only, was it lost to only the owner versus lost to humanity. So everything else stays the same. Okay. Now let's think about that. In the case where it was lost to humanity, it was lost in the river. What did Rabbi Shmuel say? You can keep it. Correct? Because it was lost to humanity. Everybody could keep it, right? Everybody could find it. And that's whether it has a siman or whether it doesn't have a siman. It's irrelevant. You can keep it. Correct? So the Gemara deduces, well, that means everything else is the same. The only difference between the case of Isser and the case of Heter is this one point. And that is, the case of Heter is that it was lost to everyone, lost to humanity. And the case of Heter is when it was only lost to the owner and anybody else can find it. In that case, you are obligated to return it, and you cannot keep it. Correct? Because we're deducing it all from the same pasuk. The pasuk is referring to where you are obligated to return it. We are deducing from there a case of Heter, that if it's lost to everybody, it's lost to humanity, you can keep it. But it's exactly, we're making a deduction from one to the other. So that means it's a, so to speak, a controlled experiment. The only difference between the two is whether it's lost to everybody or only lost to him. Everything else is the same. Now, in the case where it's lost to everyone, we were saying that it's bein the east bay siman or bein the last bay siman. Whether it has a siman on it or whether it doesn't have a siman on it, if it's lost to humanity, you can keep it. So, ergo, that means that in a case where you're obligated to return it, it also has to be bein the isba siman, bein the lesba siman. Whether it has a siman or whether it doesn't have a siman, you are forbidden to keep it, and you must return it if you can. Now, let's think. According to Rava, that does not make sense. According to Abaye, yes, but according to Rava, no. Because according to Abaye, I could find an example of where that would be true. I could find an example of where, whether it has a siman or whether it doesn't have a siman, I'm forbidden to keep it. And theoretically, I would have an obligation to return it if I could. Where would that be a case? If it's Yeush, Shelo, Mida'as. I have an example of Yeush, Shelo, Mida'as. If the owner dropped it, was unaware that he dropped it, there is an example of whether, even without a siman, I would be usher to keep it. Correct? Okay. But according to Rava, right? According to Rava, that's not true. Because according to Rava, as soon as it doesn't have a siman, even if the owner is unaware that it dropped, if I find something without a siman, I am allowed to keep it. Because Yeush, Shelo, Mida'as is considered a Yeush. In which case, there is no example of it being forbidden without a siman. Did you catch that? It's a deduction. We'll do it over quickly. Since the whole thing is based on a deduction, right? Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yotzadek is making a deduction. I see that the Torah obligated you to return a lost object if it's lost from the owner and everybody else can find it. It's only lost to the owner, it's not lost to humanity, right? Then he's obligated to return it and you cannot keep it. The deduction from there is, but if it's lost to all of humanity, you're allowed to keep it. Those two things, the entire difference between those two things is one is talking about when it's only lost to the owner, but everybody else can find it. That's a case of Isser, you're not allowed to keep it. And the other case is a case of where it's lost to humanity. Everybody loses it. It's lost for everybody. In that case, if somebody happened to find it, he's allowed to keep it. And that case is talking about whether it does or does not have a simon. So the first case also has to be talking about a case whether it does or doesn't have a simon. Because the only difference between the two is if it's lost to him or lost to humanity. Everything else seems to be the same. Otherwise, not a controlled experiment, so to speak. It's not, there are too many factors. It has to be that the one and only factor between the two is one is lost only to him and one is lost to humanity. Everything else is the same. Oh. If everything else is the same, that means that there is, by definition, an example by which that even without a siman, you are forbidden to keep it. Even though you can't return it because there's no siman, but it's still forbidden to you to return it, for you to keep it. And what would that be? That only works in Abaye. In Abaye, there is such a thing. If you found it before the guy was aware that he dropped it. So in that case, that's Yeush Mida'as. That would be Aser. But according to Rava, there's no such thing. Because according to Rava, as soon as you drop something which is Ein Bo Siman, it's automatically mutter. So there is no comparison. There's no, the control experiment doesn't work, right? You can't say, well, whatever was mutter in the case of where it's lost to humanity is aser in the case where it's only lost to him. That's not true. Because according to Rava, there's a case where it's lost to only him and it's still permitted. There's no simon. Good? You understand the deduction? It's a little, you have to catch it. So it comes out that based on this deduction, which is a deduction out of a deduction, right? We have now proven that there must be an example of Isser, where it's forbidden for me, the finder, to keep it, even without a simon. And that is only possible in Abaye. That's not possible in Rava. And therefore, Tiyuvta to Rava. We have now proven Rava wrong. We have now refuted Rava Tiyuvta. That's a refutation. I had a Rabbi who used to say in Yiddish, he says, if the Gemara says Tiyuvta de Rava Tiyuvta, it doubles it up, right? It says it's a Tiyuvta de Rava, it's a Tiyuvta, right? It is a refutation. So he used to say, bang on the table, and he says, Gekunchet. Gekunchet means, that's all, we're done. Finished. Concluded. End of line. We're done. Right? We just KO'd Rava. Took 13 rounds. But we KO'd Rava, right? We finally did it. The Hilchasa, the Gemara says, the Hilchasa is one of the rare times that the Gemara actually comes out and says what the halacha is clearly. The Hilchasa and halacha is kavase de Abaye. Like Abaye, it follows Abaye. Kavase means like de Abaye, be Ya'al Kigam. In Ya'al Kigam. Now what that means is as follows. Again, as always, whenever I don't know what something is, I immediately look at Rashi. I didn't put the Rashis over here yet, but I would. My immediate reaction is to look at Rashi whenever I find a line in the Gemara which I'm not sure what it means. You immediately look at Rashi, and Rashi explains that what Ya'al Kagam. Ya'al Kagam is a mnemonic or an abbreviation. There are 6 examples in all of Shas where the halacha is like Abaye. There are dozens of machlokes between Abaye and Rava, all over the place. Abaye and Rava were very close friends, and they did not see eye to eye on a lot of things. There are dozens and dozens of machlokes throughout Shas between Abaye and Rava. Almost always the halacha is like Rava. The Gemara says the halacha follows Abaye in 6 cases. Ye'al kegam. Okay? If you want to get to the whole list of what the Yud stands, all of these letters stand for, they stand for different machloksin. You can look at Rashi. Rashi explains all 6 of them. But the one that we are primarily interested in is the very first one, the Yud, which stands for Yeush, Shelo, Mida'as. The halacha, the Gemara is paskening. The halacha is like Abaye in Ya'al Kagam, and of course the Yud stands for Yeush, Shelo, Mida'as, which means that the Gemara is paskening halacha lemaisa like Abaye. So after all of this, we have finally concluded that the halacha is Yeush, Shelo, Mida'as, lo have Yeush. It is not considered Yeush, right? And therefore, if you are not certain that the owner knows that it dropped from him, you may not keep it, even though that you can't return it, because there's no siman. So it's impossible to return. You're still not allowed to keep it, right? According to Rava, there is no such example. There doesn't exist an example of you are not allowed to keep something even though you can't return it. Doesn't exist. Whereas according to Abaye, it does. In case of Yeush, Shelo, Mida'as, it has no siman. I can't possibly return it, but still, I'm not allowed to keep it. Good? So the Gemara is pasken halacha like Abaye, and that is, of course, how we pasken, right? In Shulchan Aruch, that's how we pasken. Good? Okay. Let's see the Gemara in 2.3, which is a follow-up to this. Let's see if we can finish it off. I'm not sure we'll have enough time, but let's try. Omar le Rav Acha brei de Rava le Rav Ashi. Rav Acha, the son of Rava, asks Rav Ashi as follows. Okay. Now I think that is Rava's son. So, brei de Rava. So it's, his son. So now he is, his father was just refuted, right? His father was wrong. Right? We proved him wrong. So now, Rav Acha, the son of Rava, asked Rav Ashi the following question. V'chi me'acher di'itos of Rava. And now, since that Rava was refuted, okay, now that we've proven that Rava is, so to speak, wrong, halachically speaking, we do not learn like Rava. Okay. So he asked an interesting question. Hani tamare de zika. These dates of the wind. Zika means wind. The dates of the wind. Now what that means is dates that the wind blew off the tree. You have these date palms. Now usually date palms are pretty, if you've ever seen a date palm, those are pretty heavy things. And they've got this big stem and hundreds of dates on them, right? It's pretty, you have to go up there. I've personally seen it when I lived in California. I personally saw, they have to go up with these enormous, pickers and, cherry pickers and go up high in order to get these things down. But it is theoretically conceivable that a really strong wind should come by, and if they're really ripe and really heavy, and a good wind comes by, catches that whole thing, it's conceivable the whole thing will get knocked off. That's about 60, 70 pounds worth of dates flying down on the floor. That's a Oh, it's pretty heavy, one of those things. So now, Hani Tzmari de Zika, these dates that are of the wind, which means that the wind blew them down, how do you eat them? Meaning, he's asking a question to Rav Ashi, and he's saying, if you hold like Rava, I understand why it is that people could eat it. They fell off the tree through, given a good wind. They fell off the tree. Okay? Now you find them on the floor. You assume they're hefker. You can take the dates and you can eat them. People apparently did that. So he's looking like this and he says, well, one second. According to Rava, that makes sense. Because even though that the owner may be unaware of the fact that the wind blew off the dates off that tree, okay, but he has no siman on it, right? Yeush, Shelo, Mida'as, Abaye, Yeush. Okay, I can understand that. I got it. Okay, so that's why you can eat that. But if you hold like Abaye, and we just refuted Rava, right? So if you hold like Abaye, you hold that Yeush Shalom Mida'as Lo Have Yeush. So now you come by, you're walking down the street, and there all of a sudden you see there's some dates that got blown off by the wind, and it's sitting there. Are you allowed to have it? Apparently, people do it. His question, Rav Acha's question was, how do you eat it? Evidently, that means that people did it. The assumption was that it was permitted to do so. Hey, but according to Abaye, why should that be? That should be a case of Yeush Shalom Mida'as, unless you are certain that the owner knows that it dropped. And how do you know that the owner knows it? Fair question. That's what he asked Rav Ashi. Okay, Omar Lay. So Rav Ashi gave him a following answer. He says, Kivan, since the Ika, that there are shkotzim uramasim, since there are shkotzim uramasim means there are insects and rodents, creepy crawler thingies, that will eat them. Meikara Yushem Yayesh Minaya. From the very beginning, the person is miyayesh from them. Wow. Very interesting. Rav Ashi comes up with what seems to be a pretty big chiddush. And he says, you're right. The owner may not know that it dropped. You're aware, it's true. However, since the owner knows that in the event that it does drop, when the whole thing of dates, whole clump of dates is going to fall on the floor, he knows that in quick order it's going to be an attraction to ants and birds and who knows what other creepy crawlers and little rodents and all sorts of animals that are going to be interested in this big thing of dates. Meikara from the very beginning is miyayesh. And therefore, even though he doesn't know that it fell, he's miyayesh from the very beginning. From the very, all the way from beginning. That's amazing, right? Which is an amazing thing. Right? I would never have thought to say that. But he's basically saying that the owner knows he's planting this date palm, knowing that in the event that anything falls down, forget it, I'm miyayesh already. I'm just hoping that I am able to harvest these dates before they fall down. But if the wind comes and knocks them down, I'm miyayesh from the very beginning. Now, I would have never said that, right? If you would have asked me, I would have said, well, a person assumes that they're going to be his, and if he, until they do fall down, right? But that's Rav Ashi's chiddush. It's an amazing chiddush. that Rav Ashi is telling you, and that's the reason why people can have it, why people can eat it. Wow. It's pretty bold of Rav Ashi to say that. So here we have a new, shall we say, window into Abaye. Because we're saying, even according to Abaye, who holds Yeush lo Mida'as, lo havi Yeush, right? But in the event where a person has something where he knows for sure that if this falls down, it's considered that he'll lose it because it'll get eaten by rodents almost immediately, right? And it's gone. We consider that as if that it was miyayish from the very beginning. Wow, it's a big chiddush. As a Rabbi of mine once said, Englander, if you would have said that, I would have thrown you out the window. He says, but I can't do that because Rav Ashi said that. Okay? Okay, yeah, okay. So the Gemara says, okay, that's interesting. So Yasmi. Now the Gemara says something very curious. Yasmi are orphans. Telav b'nei mechila ninu. That they are not capable of being mochel. They're not capable of being mochel. No, let me explain that. What I mean by that is, orphans are the rare kind of situation where they may own property and they don't have a parent. They are still minors and they own property. If, let's say, for example, that a person's father passed away and they were still a child, they become landowners because they inherited that which the father had, the estate of the father they inherit, but they're still a child. Now, the halacha goes like this. Ordinarily speaking, being as a child is not considered someone who is responsible. So, in such a situation, the Beis Din will actually intervene and will actually appoint a apotropos. Apotropos basically means a guardian, a person who is going to be responsible for them until they are old enough to make their own decisions about the property and the estate that they just got a hold of, right? I mean, the child may be 3 years old. I mean, he may require a guardian for a while. Now, while they are children, the halacha is that they cannot make any kind of halachic transaction. They can't be makneh. They can't give over something. They can't, if they own something, they can't say, okay, now I'm giving it over to you. They're not capable of doing it. We don't consider them having das. So because that they don't have das, they cannot give over, they can't make a transaction. Likewise, they can't forgive something. They can't just give up on something. They can't be miyayish, they can't be mochel, right? They can't forgive something. Are you aware of that? If you do something against the child, then he can't be mochel you. You have to wait until his bar mitzvah to be mochel you. As a matter of fact, there's a famous story. I'll just digress for a moment. Famous story that the Stipler Gaon, the Reb Chaim Kanievsky's father, who had a very difficult time walking because he had very bad legs, on a particular Shabbos, he said, I have to go. And with his cane and with his walker, he painstakingly walked, what was for him a huge distance, probably about a 20-minute walk for most people. For him, it probably took about an hour and a half, right? To walk to a particular bar mitzvah. And why did he do that? He didn't even know the kid so well. He says he walked to the bar mitzvah. Why did he do that? He says he remembered that about 3 or 4 years before that, the boy came in to the Stipler's house or whatever it is, And the stipler must have said something or done something, I don't know what the details were, and he felt that he may have, shall we say, insulted the boy or did something that the boy would feel that he took offense to. And he felt bad about that. And the stipler wanted now, he took into consideration, I don't want this child. He couldn't be meichel me until he's a bar mitzvah. So he walked an hour and a half on that Shabbos because now he was bar mitzvah. He found out that he was bar mitzvah. He wanted to have the mechila. So he walked it. Imagine that? That's amazing. Anyway, it's a famous story. So a child can't be meichel. Can't be meichel, therefore he can't give up hope either. He can't be miyayish. He can't make something hefker. No transactions are viable. It just simply he's not considered a bardas to be able to make any kind of halachic transaction at all. So he asked him an interesting question. He says, okay, yasmi, what happens if they are yesomim? If they are orphans, and they're young orphans, let's say, to lav b'nei mechila ninu, that they are not capable of being moichel. And they own this date palm. Then what's the halacha then? So are you allowed to eat that? So again, here comes, you come across this date palm. People eat it. So the Gemara says, well, how could you eat it according to Abaye? So Rav gave this chiddush. It's considered like it was Yeush from the very beginning because he knew that if it fell down, rodents would get to it. Insects would get to it. Okay. So he says, well, what about if it belongs to an orphaned child? Most likely you don't know whose tree that was. Maybe it was an orphaned child. So Amar Lei, so he told him, Baga ba'ara diasmi lo machzikinam, which means a valley or we'll call it a valley. You don't presume that valley, that it belongs to an orphan child. Even though that, it does happen. I mean, it's theoretically possible that it could happen. We don't have to presume, we don't have to suspect for this rare instance that there would be an orphan child who was a minor and owned that piece of land. You don't have to suspect of that. Being as it's a very rare case that such a thing should occur, this passerby who happens upon a thing of dates, he does not have to worry about that.
Who said we're talking about a valley?
I'm talking about, it doesn't mean a valley. I mean, just you're walking by and you see something. You don't have to assume that this land belongs to some, it's lo shchiach, and therefore you can go with the majority cases. Majority cases is that that's not an issue, right? And therefore you are allowed to presume that this is owned by a person who is older, and he can be meichel, and he is meichel even from the very beginning. So the Gemara says, okay, muchzok v'omeid mai. What happens if it was already established? You happen to know that this particular land was owned by a orphaned minor. What's the halacha? Or kirchasa, Rashi, I didn't know what kirchasa means, so of course I looked at Rashi. Rashi says it means what happens if it was fenced around. And therefore, it was tried to, they put a fence in such a manner that even if it would fall down, the owners would be able to try to keep it. They built a fence in such a way that rodents wouldn't be able to get to it. So, what's the halach in that case? Which clearly shows that they are interested in keeping even those ones that happen to fall. So he told him, you're right, in that case, asira. Then they are forbidden. So it comes out like this. This Gemara is a conclusion of the previous Gemara and is saying That a chiddush of Rav Ashi, that when dates fall down, we have a right to assume that the owners were originally miyayish from the beginning, and therefore a person to find the passerby may take it if he wants to. But that's provided that we don't know that who the owner of this thing is. So then we don't have to suspect maybe it's the 1 in 100 chance that this property belongs to a orphaned minor, and therefore he can't be miyayish even if he wanted to. And another thing is, in the event that you see clearly that he did something in order to be able to save those dates that fell, i.e. that he built some sort of fencing around it in such a manner that encircled the tree and therefore he wanted to keep it, clearly he was not miyayish, are you allowed to eat them? The answer would then be no. Then I agree with you. You're not allowed to eat it. So this is the ending of this piece of the Gemara. And so concludes the story of Yeush Shalom Mida'as. Of course, it doesn't really conclude it. We just got through the Gemara, right? And now you can spend the next year and a half working through all the Tosos and all the Rishonim and all the Achrayim. But we got through at least the basic Gemara. Okay, we did it.